Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. 36 hours ago, Russia's President Vladimir Putin used a televised address to declare war on Ukraine. Within minutes, explosions were reported in the north, east and south of the country. Hundreds of people have been killed. In the hours that followed, shockwaves were experienced throughout the global economy. Severe sanctions and export controls have been imposed upon Russia. Oil and gas prices have jumped to record highs, and the world looks on in shock as long-standing assumptions about European security have been shattered. On today's Channel's Business Global, I'll be examining the socio-economic, geopolitical and humanitarian fallout of the Russian onslaught. Here in our London studio, I'll be joined by our business correspondent Simon Pusey. Investment banker Greg Swenson will also be here with me in the studio for an update on the White House response, and the former British Minister of State for Europe and Climate to the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, Dennis McShane, will be joining me for his assessment. But first, let's have a look at some of the newspaper headlines here in the UK from this morning. Putin invades, says the Guardian front page, which, along with every other paper, is dominated by the first day of the Russian attack on Ukraine. It says Ukraine is fighting for its survival, with hundreds dead or injured in a huge Russian offensive. Alongside this photo of a woman injured in an airstrike. This face is on the front of several front pages. Her blood, his hands, is the headline on the front of the Daily Mirror, alongside contrasting images of the same bandaged airstrike victim, who the paper says is a teacher. And below, they've described Russian President Vladimir Putin as being power-crazed. Beside an image of fire and smoke rising from the site of a missile strike in Kiev, the Financial Times says the West condemned the biggest challenge to European peace in 80 years. The paper quotes US President Joe Biden, warning that Mr. Putin wants to re-establish the former Soviet Union, which stretched across more than a dozen states to the west and south of Russia. We'll be looking at more newspaper headlines later on in the show. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has hit Russia with what he called the largest set of sanctions ever imposed anywhere by the UK government, targeting individuals with personal ties to Vladimir Putin, including his former son-in-law. Making a statement in the Commons, the Prime Minister said that more than 100 businesses and individuals will be tackled, which includes all the major manufacturers that support Putin's war machine.
We will continue on a remorseless mission to squeeze Russia from the global economy piece by piece, day by day and week by week. And we will, of course, use Britain's position in every international forum to condemn the onslaught against Ukraine, and we will counter the Kremlin's blizzard of lies and disinformation by telling the truth about Putin's war of choice and his war of aggression. And we will work with our allies on the urgent need to protect other European countries that are not members of NATO and who could become targets of Putin's playbook of subversion and aggression.
Earlier, I spoke with our business correspondent Simon Pusey for some analysis. Simon, it's been almost 36 hours since the invasion. What's the latest?
Yeah, so at the moment, forces are closing in on Kiev. I think it's safe to say that Ukraine will fall in the next few days. There's definitely been defense from Ukrainians. Russia say 118 military targets have been taken out on Thursday. In the last few hours, the Chernobyl nuclear site also fell to Russian forces. They're saying they are there to protect it from what they call terrorists. President Zelensky said that 137 Ukrainians have been killed so far, 316 wounded, many of those civilians from airstrikes. Obviously, Russia saying that they're targeting military sites, but we've seen lots of footage of apartment blocks being hit. The Defense Ministry calling on locals to rally and even make Molotov cocktails to throw out forces as they come in. It sounds pretty desperate in terms of the defence, because they're even saying that there's no age limit now on the people who they're trying to call up to conscript. So even over 60s, they're saying just come and get involved. And yeah, they're just calling for people to fight to defend Kiev. But I think it just looks likely the size of the Russian army and the forces that they're up against that it's not going to work out. But they want to put up some kind of defence. And this sort of transcends not just military, but but it goes into all walks of life. So the Champions League final has been moved from Moscow to Paris. There are calls for Formula One not to be held in Russia. The Vitaly and Vladimir Klitschko, the Klitschko brothers, famous boxers, they say they're going to join up and fight. And there have been protests in Russia as well, in Moscow and in St. Petersburg and in many other cities. In Moscow, nearly 1,000 people detained for protesting because, classified or unlegalized protests are not allowed. So it's
grim.
It's really, really bad what's happening, of course, and there are so many different strands to it. But I think the main line is that Ukraine will fall to Russia, and I think the main question is what happens next? What is President Putin's plan? Is he going to install a pro-leaning Russian person as president and say, that this is the new democracy? Because obviously it's all a power struggle in that region. And the reason he's doing this is because of NATO expansion and Ukraine wanting to join NATO and him feeling that Russia is particularly vulnerable. So I think in the next week or so, it's the question doesn't shift to will Ukraine fall? It will, and then what happens next? Who is going to take over, and how are they going to do it?
UK response?
Yeah, so sanctions, the huge package of sanctions we keep hearing.
Is it enough?
Well, the hard thing is SWIFT, everyone's talking about SWIFT. This is tens of thousands of banks use this to move money around, and that would really, really hurt the Russian economy. The problem with that is that you need all countries to sign up to that, and a lot of countries are very dependent on Russian banks and institutions.
Germany apparently.
Exactly, so it's going to be really hard for that to happen, but I think that is what certainly the Ukrainian government are calling for, because that would really hit Russia hard. I guess it's just, is that feasible to happen? But there's going to be a huge raft of sanctions that haven't exactly been announced yet, but the international coordination around that does seem to be very good. It does seem to be a lot stronger than maybe Putin had considered. Europe, America, Australia, Japan, all working together to come out with these sanctions. I think it's just going to be hard for that SWIFT thing to go through.
Absolutely. Thank you, Simon. We are, of course, staying with this developing story, but we'll now turn our focus to Washington. Last night, President Joe Biden acknowledged a wave of incoming turbulence for US gas prices and potentially other areas of the economy, but vowed that his administration would do everything it could to minimize the effect felt by Americans.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russia stock market plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets.
Let's hear more from Greg Swenson, a founding senior partner at investment firm Brigg McAdam. Do you think the president was right to swiftly rule out sending US troops into Russia? We know that Russia versus Ukraine is not really a fair fight.
No, it's not a fair match. I think it was a mistake. And it doesn't mean that there's any appetite for boots on the ground or U.S. military involvement. I don't think he'd have the support for that at home, nor do I think that there's much support for that here in the U.K. But Prime Minister Johnson left it out there. You know, he didn't take it off the table. He even mentioned it in his speech last night, which was an excellent speech by most measures. Whereas President Biden has telegraphed, not just telegraphed, he's said countless times that there will be no U.S. involvement.
Why?
I think he's just nervous about where he's polling in the U.S. right now. The last thing he needs is to get the U.S. into a conflict. He's polling in the high 30s, low 40s. He's been a failure on almost every metric that you can measure in his first year. So the last thing he needs is that. So I think politically, it was a good move for him to say that for his audience in the U.S. But telling the enemy that you're not going to fight is just completely unnecessary. And I think it was a huge mistake. Again, I don't think there's much support to do it, so maybe he was just being realistic. But I don't think that telling Putin that there's no chance that the U.S. will be involved. I think that's a
bit
mistake.
of a bad strategy there. Got to say this headline. The Independent newspaper said, whatever you do, don't ask whether Putin would have invaded Ukraine if Trump was still president.
Right.
Got to ask you.
I've heard, the questions come up quite a bit, and the answer is probably not, but we can't say that with 100% confidence at all. I think that's, Monday morning quarterbacking, as we say in the U.S. But it's clear that Biden's approach to Putin and Russia was very different than President Trump's, and even in greater contrast, Trump's attitude and accomplishments in terms of how he was dealing with Russia were much different and much better than Obama and Biden in the prior administration. So I think, as soon as Biden got into office, the first thing he did was shut down the Keystone Pipeline and start basically a war on the energy sector in the U.S., which only helps Putin. It helps OPEC too, but surely taking the energy independence away from the U.S. and their ability to export great amounts of LNG, for example, to Europe, that was just a strategic error right out of the gates. And then at the same time, approving the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, since, as you know, Wednesday, the Germans finally put a stop to that. But that's, those were the messages coming from Biden. Shut down Keystone, wave in Nord Stream, and cut the military spending. Trump, on the other hand, not only was he increasing military spending, peace through strength, which is very Reagan and Thatcher-esque, but also, he sent Javelin missiles to Ukraine, lethal weapons, as opposed to Obama, where they would not send any lethal weapons. They sent some, food and supplies, but they shipped it, they shipped it to the U.S. Air Base in Poland and then trucked it to Ukraine in commercial trucks so they wouldn't offend Vladimir. And I think that was a mistake. So, whereas when Trump came in, lethal weapons, increased military spending, got out of the very unpleasant and inefficient.
It's described as Putin's puppet, though.
Well, that's what's funny is that's what the media went with. I think it was, the Russia collusion hoax was a huge distraction and took away from the real issues. And that was completely, as we know now, fabricated by the Clinton campaign. But I think, the other thing was there was an intermediate missile treaty that Putin had been violating. So Trump backed away from it and said, we're leaving the treaty. If you're going to cheat, we won't participate in it. Biden got back into the treaty, understood that he did continue with the lethal weapon shipping. So that was not a mistake. That was good news. But his war on energy and his attempt, anyway, at reducing military spending in the U.S., he was actually rebuffed by Congress, including the Democrats. So now we've had a slight increase in spending. But those are mistakes, but they're also just messages to Putin. And then you throw on the disaster in Afghanistan, which really emboldened Putin and Xi and China. And so I think there's some merit to that argument. I mean, it's impossible to say, of course, but surely it would be a lot less likely if you didn't have Biden, with the war on energy, with waving in Nord Stream, with cutting military. That's just the wrong message. And,
absolutely. You mentioned Xi, Greg. I've got to bring China into this.
Sure.
They've yet to call the attack an invasion. We know that they're waiting in the lines if Russia turned to them because of these sanctions.
Sure.
Are we witnessing possibly this new world order that everybody has spoken about?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it's clear that they do have an emerging partnership, to say the least. It could end up being, an axis. And, there's no, obviously Putin was visiting Xi, or at least meeting with him right before the Olympics, I think. But China is building now they're building pipelines from Russia to China to buy natural gas and oil. That's a quite obvious move, because there might be a threat from the Europeans and the U.S. to a certain degree. I mean, the U.S. actually buys oil from Russia, which really troubles me, given that, again, we were energy independent a year ago. But I think with China potentially buying natural gas, that takes away, the threat of sanctions from the Europeans. Now, that will take some time, of course, but you can see it starting already.
Greg Swenson, the founding senior partner at investment firm Brigg McAdam. It's always a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Great to be here.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Coming up on Channels Business Global, I'll be speaking with the former British Minister of State for Europe and Climate to the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, Dennis McShane. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Let's resume by having a look at some more headlines from British newspapers today. War in Europe is the Metro's headline. As it says, Mr. Putin was branded a 21st century Hitler by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Daily Star front page makes the same comparison in a mocking tone, crudely painting a Hitler moustache and slicked hair onto an image of the Russian president. Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Putin? The paper's headline asks. And Ukraine's agony is the newspaper's headline, alongside a photo of a woman clasping her hands as if in prayer. The paper says more than 50 people have been killed, though we know now that there are much more than that. They also report that hundreds are injured and hundreds of thousands are trying to flee on gridlocked roads. Before we hear from the former British Minister of State for Europe and Climate to the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, Dennis McShane, let's listen in to more Global Reacts.
We don't need sanctions that bark. We need sanctions that bite. And if the sanctions bite, they need to bite in a very thorough way. It means that we need sanctions that have a big impact on the Russian side. That means that for Belgium, what is on the table today as a package of sanctions should be put into action as swift as possible. But from our side, we would like to add additional financial sanctions, which makes it hard for Russian financial institutions, Russian corporates, makes it harder for them to access the international financial markets.
First of all, I'm very glad when I heard that Germany is abandoning their support for Nord Stream 2. I think this is some kind of game changer, but we have to make a step further. So we woke up in different Europe, in different world today, and we have to act according to a new situation. So speaking about sanctions, as we know, sanctions from recent history is not enough.
Dennis, one of the latest developments this morning is that Russia has banned British airlines from its airspace. Do you think we should expect a further response to the new sanctions that were imposed by the British government upon Russia earlier this week?
It'll take some time for them to hit. I was very amused, for example, to learn that the Russian oligarch close to Putin, who owns the biggest house in London, I mean, some giant mansion in Knightsbridge or somewhere, well, a good friend of the government, of course, he was at a Kremlin party this week celebrating the invasion. So, I mean, the oligarchs are just laughing at this. Banning Aeroflot was obviously going to get a response of banning British Airways. But if you think Roman Abramovich has been on an ordinary scheduled airplane for the last 20 years, wake up. I mean, these guys don't fly British Airways or Lufthansa or Aeroflot or anything. They're in their private jets. If they want to come, they can nip over to Istanbul and come in on Turkish Airlines. There's some symbolic things that are being done that are feel-good things for the government doing them. And I'm not blaming Mr. Johnson for it, but they're absolute pinpricks and not very relevant.
Do you think the government should do more?
I think very much that they should just decide we've got to get off, if you'll excuse the vulgar expression, the tit of Londongrad. We've got to get off being so dependent on Russian money. BP, one of our biggest companies, its CEO sits on the board of Rosneft, which is a Putin-controlled energy company used by Putin to promote Russian interests. What are we doing? We are open house now to so many oligarchs who come in here. It's important for bits of the economy, the high-end economy, the luxury economy, the rich private schools economy, above all, mansions and flats in Knightsbridge that cost £100, £200, £300 million. But these are the guys who control Russia, run Russia, have denied Russian people freedom, and now have authorised this invasion of a fellow European country.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking, isn't it? Let's take this a bit wider. China still refusing to call Russia's action in Ukraine as an invasion. What do you think we should take from that?
I think that the Chinese are terrified in case they decide to invade Taiwan, it's called an invasion. I think China just looks silly doing that. Israel, of about a third of the Israeli population are Russian. It's huge Russian immigration over many years. very close relationships with Russia for many years. They are denouncing it. So I think if Israel can call out China, then perhaps China could be a bit braver.
Absolutely. We heard earlier in the week that Olaf Scholz halted the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, even though it's already been built. But there are suggestions the country is pushing back on the removal of Russia from the SWIFT payment system. Do you think we are seeing a genuine united front from Europe?
Not entirely, and Britain is also not united with Europe, as we well know, and Britain ignored a lot of European requests to get tough on Putin beforehand. But on SWIFT, this is totally artificial as a row, because the biggest shareholder in SWIFT is, of course, the United States government. President Biden has said he's not proposing to do anything about SWIFT.
He went quite far last night, though, didn't he?
Well, not because the problem is, if you destroy SWIFT, or remove Russia out of it, then that's an open door for China to create with Russia and lots of other countries around the world an alternative. I mean, it's just a money transfer system. I mean, it's mega sums that you and I can only dream about, but that's all it is. And China is desperate to lessen the dominance of the United States as the world's financial hegemon. It's still a big military power, but it hasn't been able to stop the invasion of Ukraine, but still SWIFT is really basically an American and Euro-Atlantic project, and we boot Russia out. That again is an initial reaction that makes you feel good, but actually would play right into China's hands. So it's just all of these issues. It's like closing down RT, the Russian propaganda station operates here in Britain. I and most people have refused to go on it for years because it's a propaganda station. It has no audience, no influence. It has left behind ex-big mouths like George Galloway and Alex Salmond on it. You close down RT, what does Putin do? He boots the BBC out of Russia. And I would say we want the BBC to stay in Russia, stay reporting through the Russian language service to the Russian people what is going on, the truth that their own media don't give them. This is actually, it stems from the fact that we were never willing to give effective support to Ukraine when it should have been given 8 years ago when David Cameron was in power.
Before I get you go, Dennis, I've got to try and tap into your wealth of expertise here. What is the end game? What do you expect to happen over the coming weeks, months, years?
Very sadly, I mean, it's clear that the Ukrainian soldiers have been fighting bravely. They brought down at least one Russian airplane, it said, probably using a Turkish drone, which is interesting that the Turkey is helping the Ukrainians when we refuse to do so. But nonetheless, it's like an 11-year-old going into a fight with one of the great heavyweight boxers. Russia has all of those military cards. But once Putin's there, what is he going to do? Will the Ukrainians lie down? Could we see another Afghanistan? Just even think in our own patch, we had a 20-year civil war in Northern Ireland, where sadly soldiers and police officers were killed. They're easy targets for angry Ukrainians. So well, then what does Putin do? Go in and execute them all, put every Ukrainian up against a wall? So I think this is going to drag on and on and on. I don't know where the Ukrainian government will go. It may have to go into exile. And this is going to be a very, very big test for the democratic world, because the UN has showed it has toothless. NATO has showed it can't defend democracy. The EU has never been a military power, but also it's taken far too long for Germany, for example, to close down Nord Stream 2, and we still haven't cleaned up Londongrad. So there's a lot of work to be done. I don't think it's going to end quickly. I don't think it's going to end well.
Goodness, some bleak analysis there for you, but only the truth. Thank you very much, Dennis McShane. Thank you. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for you today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.